It was a quiet evening in 2005 at a busy airport in London. Passengers slowly made their way through the terminal, carrying bags, checking tickets, and preparing for another routine flight. British Airways Flight 870 was scheduled to depart for Budapest. For most people on board, it was just a normal journey. Some were traveling for business, others for vacation. A few passengers looked tired, hoping to rest during the flight. That no one expected anything unusual. The aircraft, an Airbus A319, stood ready on the runway. Clean, modern, and reliable, it was designed with advanced systems to ensure a safe and smooth journey. Inside the cockpit, the pilots completed their final checks. Every system appeared normal. Fuel levels were correct. Weather conditions were good. There were no warning signs. Everything was exactly as it should be. Soon, the cabin doors closed. The engines powered up with a low, steady roar. The aircraft began to move. Passengers fastened their seatbelts as the plane taxied toward the runway. Moments later, clearance for takeoff was given. The engines grew louder. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, faster and faster, until it finally lifted into the sky. The city lights of London slowly faded beneath them at first. The flight was calm. The aircraft climbed smoothly through the night. The seatbelt signs were still on, but everything felt normal. Some passengers looked out the windows, watching the glowing lights below. Others leaned back, relaxing into their seats down in the cockpit. The pilots monitored their instruments. Screens displayed flight data, altitude, speed, direction, all perfectly stable. But then, something changed. Without any warning, the aircraft experienced a sudden and complete electrical failure. In an instant, everything went dark. The cockpit screens shut off. The bright displays that guided the pilots disappeared completely. The overhead panels went silent. Even the lighting in parts of the aircraft flickered and failed. For a brief moment, it felt unreal. The pilots looked at each other. This was not a minor issue. This was something far more serious. They were now flying a modern aircraft with almost no electronic systems. No primary instruments. No autopilot. No normal communication systems. Only a few backup systems remained. The situation was extremely rare and extremely dangerous. In the cabin, passengers noticed the change. The lights dimmed unexpectedly. Some people looked around, confused. A few whispered to each other, unsure of what was happening. The calm atmosphere began to shift back in the cockpit. The pilots knew they had to stay. Focused training had prepared them for many emergencies, but a complete electrical blackout like this was something few pilots ever experience. They quickly turned to their backup instruments, small, limited displays that could still provide basic information. These instruments were not designed for full flight control. They were only meant to help in short emergencies. But now, they were all the pilots had, flying an aircraft at high altitude at night without full instruments. It's like trying to navigate through darkness with only a small flashlight. Every movement must be careful. Every decision must be precise. The pilots began to assess the situation. What caused the failure? Was it temporary? Or something more serious? Without full systems, even diagnosing the problem became difficult. That communication was another challenge. With the main radio systems down, contacting air traffic control was nearly impossible. The aircraft was now isolated, moving through the sky with limited connection. To the outside world, that time felt slower. That every second mattered. The pilots knew they had one main goal: restore power. But the aircraft relied heavily on electronic systems. Restarting them was not as simple as flipping a switch. There were procedures to follow, steps to complete. But many of these instructions were stored electronically, and those systems were now offline. They had to rely on memory, training, and quick thinking. Carefully, they began working through possible solutions. Switches were checked. Systems were reset. Circuit breakers were examined. Each action was done with caution, because one wrong move could make the situation worse. Meanwhile, the aircraft continued to fly through the dark sky. Passengers sat quietly, sensing that something wasn't right. The usual sounds of a normal flight were missing. The atmosphere felt different, tense, uncertain, yet no one fully understood the seriousness of the situation inside the cockpit. The pressure was building. The pilots were facing a situation that pushed the limits of both the aircraft and their own abilities, and they knew they needed to bring the aircraft back under control before it was too late. To asterisk inside the darkened cockpit, The pilots of Flight 870 faced a situation that few ever experience. They had limited instruments, weak communication, and no clear understanding of what had caused the sudden failure. But they knew one thing: they had to act fast. The aircraft was still flying, but without full electrical power. It was vulnerable. Systems that normally worked together were now silent. Every small task required more effort. The pilots took a deep breath and focused step by step. They began working through the problem. They tried to recall emergency procedures from memory. In modern aircraft, most checklists are electronic, displayed on cockpit screens. But now those screens were gone. There was no easy guide to follow, only training. An instinct, they began checking switches across the overhead panel. Each switch controlled a different part of the aircraft's electrical system. Generators, batteries, power buses all had to be carefully examined. One wrong move could make things worse. The pilots spoke calmly to each other, confirming every action before taking it. Check this, confirm that. Try again. Time passed slowly. The aircraft continued through the night sky, steady but uncertain. Then, after several attempts, a small change. One of the systems responded. A faint sign of life appeared. Encouraged, the pilots continued. They reset more systems, carefully following a logical sequence. The goal was to bring back at least partial electrical power, just enough to restore basic control and communication. And then, it happened. The cockpit screens flickered, one by one. Some of the instruments began to return, not all of them, but enough. The pilots could now see important flight data again. Altitude, speed, direction, these critical details were slowly coming back. Relief filled the cockpit. For the first time since the blackout, they had a clearer picture of their situation. Soon after, communication systems partially returned. They were finally able to reach out to air traffic control and ground maintenance. They explained the situation quickly. A full electrical failure. Partial recovery. Systems still unstable. On the ground, engineers listened carefully. They tried to provide guidance, but the situation was complex. Information was limited, and the exact cause of the failure was still unknown. The advice they gave was cautious but not complete. Now the pilots faced a critical decision. Should they turn back to London or continue forward to Budapest? Turning back meant a familiar airport, full support, and quicker assistance. Continuing meant moving forward with partially restored systems. Hoping nothing else would go wrong, the pilots discussed their options carefully. The aircraft was now somewhat stable. Systems were working, at least for the moment. There were no immediate signs of another failure. After weighing the risks, they made a bold decision. They would continue to Budapest. At first, everything seemed under control. The aircraft cruised steadily. The restored systems appeared stable. Communication, though limited, was working. Passengers remained mostly calm, unaware of how serious things had been just moments earlier. But hidden dangers were still present as the aircraft moved through colder air at high altitude. A new problem began to develop. It started quietly, almost unnoticed. The aircraft's windscreen, the large front window of the cockpit, was exposed to freezing temperatures. Normally, special heating systems prevent ice from forming on the glass, but after the earlier electrical failure, these systems were not fully reliable. Slowly, a thin layer of frost began to appear. At first, it didn't seem like a major issue, but as time passed, the frost grew thicker. The pilots noticed it. Visibility was starting to reduce. Outside, the dark sky became harder to see. Lights in the distance appeared blurred. The captain watched carefully. The frost continued to spread. What had started as a small issue was becoming something far more serious, because for a pilot, clear visibility is essential, especially during landing, and the aircraft was still far from its destination inside the cockpit. Tension began to rise again. The pilots had already faced one major emergency. Now, another challenge was forming right in front of them. They checked the systems again, tried to increase heating, adjusted settings, but the damage had already begun. The frost did not disappear. Instead, it slowly made things worse. The pilots exchanged a look. They both understood the situation. The flight was not over yet, and the most dangerous part was still ahead. As Flight 870 moved closer to Budapest, the situation inside the cockpit became more intense. As what had started as a technical failure was now turning into a dangerous landing challenge. The frost on the windscreen had spread further. The captain looked ahead, but his view was no longer clear as the outside world appeared blurred, almost completely blocked by a thin, icy layer, and it was like trying to see through frozen glasses at night. Visibility is already limited, but now it was even worse. The runway lights, which should have been clearly visible from a distance, were faint and distorted. The captain knew this was serious. Landing an aircraft requires precision, speed, altitude, direction, everything must be perfectly controlled. And most importantly, the pilot must be able to see without clear vision. Even a small mistake can become dangerous. That the co-pilot, sitting beside him, had a slightly better view. His side of the windscreen was less affected, but still not perfect now. Teamwork became everything. That the captain focused on controlling the aircraft. The co-pilot became his eyes. They communicated constantly. Speed okay, altitude stable, runway ahead. Slightly left, every word mattered. There was no room for confusion inside the cabin. Passengers sat quietly. Some looked out of the windows, seeing only darkness. Others rested, unaware of how close they were to danger. The crew did not announce the full situation. Panic would only make things worse. Instead, they remained calm, focused on getting everyone safely to the ground, back in the cockpit. The aircraft began its descent, slowly, carefully. They reduced altitude as the ground was getting closer. The pressure was building. The captain adjusted the controls with steady hands. Every movement was smooth, controlled, deliberate. The co-pilot guided him, describing what he could see ahead. The runway lights were now closer, but still not clear. The frost continued to block most of the captain's view. For a moment, the situation felt almost impossible, but the pilots did not panic as they trusted their training. They trusted each other. The aircraft lined up with the runways, not perfectly but close, enough that they made small corrections left, then right. Holding the center line as best as they could, the descent continued closer and closer. The ground was now just moments away. The captain prepared for landing. His view was still blurred, but he relied on the co-pilot's guidance and the remaining instruments. Approaching minimums, the co-pilot said calmly, this was the critical point. If they could not land safely, they would have to go around and try again. But with the current situation, another attempt would be just as risky, maybe. Even worse, the captain made his decision. They would land. The runway lights grew brighter. The aircraft crossed over the runway threshold. Just a few seconds. More, the captain gently pulled back on the controls. The aircraft descended. The final few feet got, and then touchdown. The wheels hit the... Are you into a firm but controlled landing? The aircraft rolled forward, slowing down as the pilots applied the brakes inside the cockpit. There was a moment of silence then. Relief. They had done it. Out against all odds, they had safely landed the aircraft in the cabin. Passengers felt the landing and began to relax. Some even smiled, thinking it was just another normal rival. They had no idea how close they had come to. Disaster. That the aircraft taxied to a stop. The engines powered down. The flight was over, but the story was far from finished in the days that followed. Investigators carefully studied what had happened. A complete electrical failure in a modern aircraft was extremely rare. That the frost on the windscreen raised even more concerns. Engineers examined the systems, searching for answers. They discovered weaknesses, design flaws that had not been fully understood before. The incident revealed how vulnerable advanced aircraft could become when critical systems failed, but it also showed something else: is the importance of human skill, the calm thinking of the pilots, their ability to adapt, to work together, and to stay focused under pressure. Because of this flight, changes were made, systems were improved, that software was updated, safety procedures were reviewed and strengthened, lessons were learned, lessons that would help prevent future disasters. Flight 870 became more than just an incident. That it became a warning, a reminder that even the most advanced technology can fail, and when it does, it is human judgment, courage, and teamwork that make the difference between chaos and survival.